Hello, thank you for joining us. I'm Ariel Pate, Assistant Curator of Photography here at the Milwaukee Art Museum, and I'm so excited to welcome you to today's tour of Susan Meiselas through a woman's lens with Lisa Sutcliffe, the Herzfeld Curator of Photography and Media Arts. Today, Lisa will be taking us on a virtual tour of the show, which is installed in the Herzfeld Center for Photography and Media Arts and is currently available virtually on mam.org. With the museum temporarily closed due to COVID-19, we've pivoted this exhibition to a virtual presentation, and what we will be walking through with Lisa is a rich, interactive offering. This is in great part due to the intensely collaborative effort between Lisa and artist Susan Meiselas. The exhibition looks at the lives of women as seen by Meiselas, and here in the virtual realm, the voices and experiences of the photographer's subjects really come to the fore in a way that enriches the work. This is in no small part due to how Lisa has skillfully pulled out themes of feminism and women's realities from Meiselas' 50-year body of work. And I want to personally thank Lisa for her vision and leadership in the exhibition. I'm so proud to have assisted on what she's presenting today. Before we begin, I also want to thank our members. Thank you for what you do in playing a vital role in supporting and shaping the past, present, and future of the museum. And I'd like to thank the sponsors of Susan Meiselas Through a Woman's Lens. First off, curatorial support for the exhibitions in the Herzfeld Center for Photography and Media Arts are made possible by the Herzfeld Foundation. Thank you. Also thanks to our supporting sponsor, the Northern Trust, our contributing sponsor, the David C. and Sarah Jean Ruttenberg Arts Foundation, and of course, the museum's Visionaries, a special group of donors that underwrite a year of exhibitions, allowing us to look more broadly at our exhibition schedule, as well as the connections between exhibition programming and community. Our visionaries are Donna and Donald Baumgartner, John and Murph Burke, Sheldon and Marianne Lubar, Joel and Karen Quadracci, Sue and Bud Seelig, and Jeff Yabuki and the Yabuki Family Foundation. And of course, a thank you to our community partners for this exhibition, Lotus Legal Clinic and the Sojourner Family Peace Center. And now I'd like to introduce Lisa. Lisa Sutcliffe is the Herzfeld Curator of Photography and Media Arts. Previously, she served as Assistant Curator at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art and the Co-Curatorial Fellow at the De Cordova Sculpture Park and Museum in Lincoln, Massachusetts. She holds a MA in the History of Art from Boston University, where she specialized in the history of photography, and a BA in art history from Wellesley College. Lisa has organized numerous exhibitions since joining the museum, including Sarah Swinar, Image Model Muse in 2019, the San Quentin Project, Nigel Poor and the Men of San Quentin State Prison in 2018, Rinika Dijkstra Rehearsals in 2016, and Penelope Umbrico, Future Perfect, among many others. Before we begin, I just wanted to mention one logistical thing. For today's talk and tour, please enter your questions using the Q&A function of Zoom, and Lisa will answer them at the end of the tour. With that, I'll hand it over to Lisa.
Thank you, Ariel. What a lovely introduction. And I'd like to start by thanking Ariel Pate for working so hard on this exhibition, especially as we transition to the virtual realm, and to all the people at the museum who helped us pivot into a virtual exhibition. It's really been a team effort, and it's meant so much over these past 8 months. So I am Lisa Sutcliffe, the Herzfeld Curator of Photography and Media Arts at the Milwaukee Art Museum, and the curator of this exhibition, Susan Meiselas, Through a Woman's Lens. The exhibition was meant to open in April of 2020, and like so many things, this plan was derailed by the COVID-19 pandemic. But when this exhibition was postponed due to the COVID pandemic, rather than seeing this as a challenge, we began to envision the opportunities a virtual tour might offer. And we spent the past 6-7 months combing Susan's archive to create an experience that provides an opportunity to examine her photographic oeuvre more deeply, to hear from the artist, the people she photographed, her collaborators, examine related publications and ephemera, and watch historical films and interviews that provide context for the artist's process. For us, and for me especially, this tour has been a silver lining during this time, a very challenging year, I assume, for all of us. And so I hope that it will provide you with some moments of reflection and that you will enjoy exploring everything it has to offer. The collaborative process is just one example of the way in which collaboration plays an essential role in Susan's practice. Meiselas is not just a photographer, but she is an important voice and mentor in the field. Collaboration is central not only to the way she works, but to her process and indeed her way of living. As the president of the Magnum Foundation, she has mentored and supported a new generation of diverse photographic voices. And as an artist, she continually returns to conversation with the people she has photographed. We're going to take a look at that a little bit more in depth today. So why this show now? Susan Meiselas has been working for nearly 50 years. She's an important voice in social documentary practice. But 2020 marks the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote. And so it is an opportune moment to honor and examine the legacy of a woman whose commitment to collaborative practice has made such an enduring mark on the field. Susan and I deliberated the title of this exhibition, and I think we were both somewhat uncomfortable with it, but I think it does provide us with a way in which to consider her perspective as we examine both her photographic and collaborative practice and discover how she ultimately sought to move beyond being defined as a woman photographing women. So I'm going to show you some pictures from the install of the exhibition, which I hope you will be able to go to the museum and see when we eventually do reopen to the public. But in the meantime, you can explore our virtual exhibition online in the museum's website. But I've included some installation shots here as well, just so you can get a sense of what the exhibition looks like. The exhibition focuses on an aspect of the early period of Susan's work in which, guided by her own intuition, she focused on the lives and perspectives of women on the edges of the mainstream, narratives that might have otherwise been overlooked. Many of the pictures taken in the 1970s record the moment during which they were made, when women were asking important questions about gender equality and their roles at home, in politics, and in the world. And here you're seeing a photograph Susan made of women delegates on the floor of the Democratic National Convention in 1976. And the sort of picture of Susan around that time when she first entered Magnum Photos. From sorority girls, strippers, and beauty queens to boxers and delegates, these women shatter the narrow spectrum of female representation that predominated in visual culture. And I love comparing these two pictures, one from a sorority taken in Madison, Wisconsin in 1978, and on the right, backstage, Miss Nude USA in 1976, thinking about Susan as a kind of anthropologist, someone who's really interested in how women act when they're together, how they might prepare to go out into the world, and what it looks like to prepare oneself to perform oneself. Together, the pictures present a portrait not only of women at the time, but also of an artist coming of age during the women's movement who understood the challenges women faced, including the structures that limited their opportunities. The exhibition considers this period as a foundation for her documentary practice, grounded in collaboration and immersion, and we're going to talk a lot about what that term means, and for her constant exploration of how photography might act as a platform to bring the stories, not just of women, but of people on the periphery to a larger audience. So this gives you a sense of the curatorial perspective, but the virtual exhibition gives you a chance to hear from the artist, from her collaborators, and we'll talk a bit about what that context means as we walk through the exhibition. So here I'm showing you an installation view of 20 dirhams or one photo, which was a project Susan was commissioned to make when she went to Marrakesh. And this is the original installation at the Marrakesh Museum of Photography and Visual Arts in 2013. If you walk through the virtual exhibition, you'll get a chance to hear from her collaborators on this project, Iman Barakat and Leila Hida, who we held a Zoom with last summer, 2020, and recorded the conversation. They were in Marrakesh. Susan was in New York, and I was in Milwaukee. And we talked a little bit about what it meant to form a collaboration in which Susan would go to Marrakesh and invite people to consider the transaction of a studio portrait. So here she's really interrogating the transactional quality of photography and uncovering what kind of trust you have to build to make a portrait, especially when considering that you're making these portraits in a place and in a culture where women have historically been exoticized as the other. And so here I'm showing you a picture on the left that Susan made as part of this project, where she worked with the two women to create a photo studio and offer portraits where the woman could either take the portrait or she could be paid 20 dirham. And so what you see in the installation is 20 dirham or the picture, depending on which the woman chose. And so here I'm showing you an example of something that Susan and her collaborators are perhaps responding to, which is a portrait that Marc Guéranger made when he was a 25-year-old military draftee during the French-Algerian War and was assigned to make portraits of women against their will for ID cards. And you can see sort of the emotion with which they react to having their portraits made against their will, having to remove their veil for a Western conqueror in a way. And so Susan, knowing this history, going in and thinking about what it means to make a portrait of these women today. So in a way, this points to Susan's longstanding interest in interrogating the ethics of photography, examining the relationships photography builds between photographer and subject, between subject and viewer, and considering how she might best connect the viewer with the subject. How might she mediate ethically? And that brings us to the self-portrait that Susan made while living at 44 Irving Street in Cambridge, Massachusetts, attending Harvard University in 1971. And Susan talks beautifully about this self-portrait as a kind of metaphor for the way in which she works. So thinking about her both being absent and present at the same time, what that transparency means when you are attempting to build relationships and make portraits and work with people and present them to others. So this is a kind of perspective she has on herself and on photography and what her role as mediator might look like. And we'll see what that means as we walk through the exhibition. So the first room considers Susan's early work and interest in developing personal relationships, examining community, considering the role of collaboration and what it means to become a part of a place. And what you're looking at here is two of the walls of the exhibition, including the work made at 44 Irving Street, where she took portraits of the people who were living in her boarding house, but didn't want to just simply present the portrait. She also wanted to invite them to respond. And so she offered them the picture. And then you can see that on the right, Joan, who's in the portrait, has considered what the picture looks like and written her response to it. And she says, "I like living at 44 Irving Street. I think it is nicer than most rooming houses. No dirty old men. I like having people around, and I also need lots of privacy, which I can get by closing my door. When you share an apartment with roommates, you have too many obligations, and this leads to hassles. I also like living in a male-female house. 44 Irving Street is such an interesting mishmash. It's a good cross-section of our loony bin society. I don't think the photo of me really gives the essence of me. In it, I look very serious and quiet and contemplative. It looks more like me when I was 12 and daydreamed a lot. Now I'm more energetic and restless." And I think that points to what Susan wants to capture, that no matter when you take a photograph, you're always capturing something of a person, but not how they might see themselves. And so she's got this real interest in not just making sure that we see what she saw, but making sure that we understand and hear from the person she's photographing. So here you can see a number of the portraits from 44 Irving Street, where you have photos paired with text written by the subject. And this kind of combination of the voice of the subject via text or audio or film is something you're going to see throughout her bodies of work. Here we're looking at what are small Polaroid pictures from a lesser known series, a body of work she made in Lando in 1974. She had traveled down to the South. She was living in South Carolina and working through Teach for America, teaching, but also working with the community. And here she's interested in helping them build a kind of oral and visual archive of their town. So working with kids who have Polaroids to go back and examine their own family histories, their own family snapshots, collect them and present them to the community. So this is really important to think about how Susan's interested in a kind of vernacular archiving, a kind of history that we build ourselves. Not that she's always the one taking the picture, but that she's there building a collective to consider what visual literacy means and how we tell our stories through pictures and through narrative. Here you're seeing farther into the exhibition. And this interest in community building leads Susan to examine her own neighborhood in Little Italy, where she befriended a group of girls who were called the Prince Street Girls. And she followed them from 1975 to 1992, and in fact is still in touch with them today. And indeed, we talked to Lisa and Jojo, who were two of the girls Susan photographed, for the virtual exhibition. And you can hear from them in some of the videos in this section of the exhibition. So she's interested in sort of what creates these bonds of friendship at this age, and how does that change over time? So you see on the left, the group, the Prince Street Girls with Frankie, the cousin of one of the girls. And on the right, Dee and Lisa. And I love how in so many of the pictures, they're really kind of wearing the same outfits. They're sharing the same style. You see them grow up. Carol, Jojo, and Lisa blowing bubbles on the left. Roseanne on the way to Manhattan Beach on the right. And that sense of deep connection that you have when you're young and when you have a group of friends. And Susan both inside and outside of that circle. So, you know, inviting the girls to come up and make photographs in her loft, in her dark room, but never really being one of them, kind of being on the edge, watching as they move through adolescence. And as you walk through time with her, you see the girls grow up, become women, and develop relationships, not just with each other, but with men. And you even see her sort of attending some of their weddings and hearing from them as they age. We move next into Carnival Strippers, which I think is a series for which Susan is well known and gained her entrance into Magnum Photos. So Susan had been looking at the work of photographers like Danny Lyon and Bruce Davidson and thinking about immersion. What does that mean? Gaining the trust of the people she was photographing and taking pictures from inside that sphere. So not just kind of spending one day photographing a person or a community, but perhaps like with Carnival Strippers, going back for 3 summers and slowly getting to know the people over time, developing bonds of trust, such that she might be invited in to make pictures from within their inner circle. Here is a picture of Lena on the Bally Box in Vermont from 1973, which has always been one of my favorites, where you see Lena as this kind of statuesque figure. And Lena is in fact one of the central protagonists of this story. She's surrounded by all these different figures of men, but yet she is the one with the sort of power. She's almost like she's on an auction block, and yet she commands the presence of our view, of the sort of people around her. And she's, in a way, becomes this kind of Athena figure, this statuesque figure. The women's movement looked down on this kind of work at the time, and Susan was interested in knowing what motivated the women. So the story of Lena, among other women, is woven throughout the exhibition. And these aren't just photographs, but the work is also comprised of audio Susan collected and shared as sound alongside the photographs in much the same way she shared text in 44 Irving Street. So when she originally showed this work, she had the audio of the girls in conversation with her, as well as the text when she published this as a book. And for her, this context is truly paramount. So here you see Lena over the course of 3 summers. On the left, it's Lena's first day. And you can see how she's really trying to inhabit this glamorous pose, but she doesn't really fully know what it means yet. It's like she's posing for a magazine cover without fully understanding how that language works. Whereas on the right, in 1975, in her 3rd season, you can see she fully understands the role she is performing. Her body has changed. Her costume is far more professional, and she really looks like she's been weathered by the work. Traditionally, Susan worked making pictures with a 35mm Leica, but for making the portraits, she changed to a square format and actually really worked with the girls to make pictures that they wanted. These were for their boyfriends, their husbands, their friends, and here you're seeing contact sheets. And you can see where Lena has actually selected the portrait she likes the best, which is the one that Susan prints for her. So another title of this exhibition might have been The Act of Becoming, because I think that's something that Susan is constantly examining or exploring in her photography, whether it's in women delegates on the floor of the DNC or women who are performing striptease at county fairs. She's interested in this moment, this transition between that behind the scenes and when they go to perform. And so she's constantly making pictures in Carnival Strippers of the women at the curtain that divides the space between the private and the public. And so it plays an important role in kind of creating a liminal space for the women who can present themselves as they walk through and become who they need to be. Here you see 2 images of Shorty on the left, kind of relaxing behind stage, smoking a cigarette, and on the right, performing for the men in the tent. This kind of gets at the fact that Susan's really interested in the actual work that the women have to undergo. It's not just the show, but everything that goes on behind stage, how exhausted they become, what they had to endure, and the magic they had to create. So on the left, we see Shorty just kind of perhaps anticipating what's to come or resting from having just performed. Susan talks beautifully about this picture in the virtual tour, and we'll take a look at that a little bit later. On the right, the photograph is taken from a low angle, emphasizing the kind of majesty and magic of the performance. The spectators are in focus, and you can see just how drawn they are to Shorty as she is blurred dancing for them. In a way, the picture to me emphasizes the ideal that Shorty must create, the magic that she has to perform, and the ideal that men come there to find. So it's interesting to consider this portrait of Shorty from the perspective of a woman in comparison to a painting by Manet of Olympia from 1863. Olympia, a prostitute, identified by the orchid in her hair, the bracelet, her pearl earring, was shocking when it was presented to the public because of her confrontational gaze and the idea of actually painting something this real, this vulgar. Here on the left, however, we have this gaze transformed. So the subject is at ease because she does not have to perform for the photographer. She knows Susan's there and she's veiled herself, but that's really truly for herself. So there's something interesting to consider here between women who are performing themselves for men or who can relax under the gaze of the sort of female lens. Another example here, we have Henri Cartier-Bresson photographing prostitutes in Spain in the 1930s, and the difference between how a prostitute might perform for a man with a camera, whereas Susan's interested in something far different. She's interested in the lives of the women, in the perspective of the women, and just how exhausting this work might be. Moving into the next section of the exhibition, we begin to see a broadening interest in Susan's relationships to the subject in terms of the relationship between men and women, the individual and the collective, the citizen and the state, and in particular, conflict. So here we're looking at two projects examining the subject of domestic violence. On the left, a room of one's own, and on the right, archives of abuse. Picture that she took beginning this project, which evolved to a more collaborative installation. And Archives of Abuse was the first domestic violence awareness campaign commissioned by the Liz Claiborne Foundation in the early 1990s in San Francisco. And as Susan was making pictures with women who had been survivors of domestic violence, she began to understand the power of the existing photographs and files in contrast to the pictures she could make. And in the virtual exhibition, we have a wonderfully rich discussion between Susan and Judge Susan Briel, who was her collaborative partner in the district attorney's office at the time, on what it means to create a collaborative effort around domestic violence, what it means to build trust with the survivors, how can you do this ethically, and what are the boundaries you have to make sure you are aware of. Because domestic violence and sex trafficking are issues in Milwaukee in particular, and we tend to see spikes of this during times of pandemic, we will be focusing on this subject at a conversation on February 18th, and I will tell you a little bit more about that as well. So here you see the original bus shelter poster for the series Archives of Abuse when it was on view in San Francisco in 1992. With an image from the file, and you can see it really just paper clipped to the file notes. So Susan was really interested in what the negative space meant, what's being left out, what are the narratives we can understand in determining domestic violence, and what is actually unknown. How can we tell these stories? In 1975, Susan began photographing women in the US Army as a way, sort of motivated by the idea coming out of Carnival Strippers, that she might consider what other opportunities were available to women. So much like Carnival Strippers, she is examining the entire day of the women undergoing training, not just the moments of action. So you almost wouldn't be able to tell which is which here, but on the left is a picture from Carnival Strippers of women in the dressing room, sort of playing cards, perhaps having some popcorn, waiting to go on stage. And on the right, you have two recruits examining their blisters, probably after a day of rough training. Susan talks about the divide between what it means to become part of a collective rather than having to identify yourself as an individual. And I will play you a video in just a few moments where she talks a bit more about this. But I really sort of love this contrast between women preparing for a gas prevention exercise while also perhaps even the same day or the same week, making sure that they have proper weight control and mascara training, and what that means about what we expect from women, even in the Army. And in this section of the exhibition, we reach a turning point in Susan's career where she diverges from examining women in an American setting and sets her sights on the Sandinista revolution in Nicaragua, where she was drawn in 1978 by the rising opposition to the Somoza dictatorship. And for some, this might seem like a great jump, but I think we can talk a little bit about how she might have come to be interested in this subject after having spent so much time examining women and what they faced in America at the time. You can see here she transitions to color as well. So there's that sort of jump, which again, we'll talk a little bit about as we walk through the exhibition. And it's important to note that immersion is a really important part of the way Susan works, not just in what it means for her relationship to the subject, but also in terms of the pictures that she ends up providing for us, for the viewers of the photographs. So on the right, you see one of her most well-known photographs, the Molotov Man from 1979, which really crystallizes this moment of dramatic action where he is about to throw this flaming bomb. And we know that this is the moment of war. And on the left, you see a sort of more quiet photograph, but an important one, 1 hour after the taking of San Isidro from 1979, where you actually see a woman who has become sort of forced into the armed forces themselves, perhaps without training. And when we spend some time in the exhibition, you'll be able to hear her story in particular. But I think that it's really important to consider what role immersion plays in helping us understand the consequences over time of these climactic events. So the stories of those on the margins and the bystanders as much as the actors. And in particular, I'm interested in contrasting pictures like the Molotov Man, which are well known, with the photographs of women and how they weathered the storm of the insurrection. It's also interesting to consider how Susan's interest in women in the US Army may have helped her understand what it was like for women sort of being cast into this insurrection, whether they were interested in participating or not. This is one of the earliest photographs from Nicaragua. Susan took this picture while seated in her car, and she tells an interesting story about how at the time, everyone was being searched because they couldn't tell who might be passing information back and forth. This was, of course, before the time of the internet or cell phones. But because she was an American photojournalist, American documentary photographer, she was seen as neutral and was able to kind of make these pictures even while having to confront her knowing how America might have been involved in this war and what it meant to have the privilege to be there and to take this picture. And I think we all know that this kind of privilege and this kind of neutrality is something we can't expect to hold on to today. And I just want to mention also the idea of context here. So Susan making these photographs, which are then published here on the cover of the New York Times Magazine. So these masked figures who are masking themselves so that they won't be identified or captured. And then what happens with a picture like that? So it's a picture that's taken, we see it on the cover of a magazine, and then Susan creates a mesh banner with the photograph that she installs on the anniversary of the war many years later, and you can see the kids kind of assessing what's happening in the photograph. But she's very interested in the transition of meaning over time. And that's something we'll talk a bit about as well. So relationships over time, but also building a kind of collective everywhere she goes. And this was something that was a surprise to me in preparing for the exhibition, understanding that in Nicaragua, Susan wasn't just making her own pictures and traveling with all kinds of different factions, but also understood that there was a shortage of photographic paper and that the photographers in Nicaragua couldn't make pictures because they didn't have any paper. So every time she returned, she would bring her own postcard paper with her so that they could make their own pictures, so that we could see Nicaragua from their perspective as well. And I think that's something that's really important to consider as we examine Susan's body of work more broadly. So now I'm going to transition to the 360 tour so we can walk through that as well. Bear with me for just a moment. Okay. Okay, so we are looking at the entry point to the virtual exhibition, and I just want to give you a few ideas about how you might navigate, find your way around in this space. I know it can be confusing for some, so we've given you a few tools, and here they are. You can open this kind of arrow right here, and it will tell you each of the sections, which you can go through in order, but if you get lost, you can always come back and sort of see if there are sections you missed. You can also put it into dollhouse function, which I love because who doesn't love seeing something from above and getting a sense of what the space looks like. You can look at it as a floor plan, which you probably won't need to do very often, but this will take you back to the 3D space. And when you start, you can also just move yourself around with your mouse by clicking ahead of you. And so here you are at the title wall of the exhibition. And what's really great about the virtual tour is that there's really no wrong way to go through it. There's plenty of content. And one thing we tried to do to make it a little bit easier for you is to color code the dots. So you'll see that there are dots that you can click on. And so we have the dot key here. A gray would be the title or the label for the work you're looking at. A dark gray is a high resolution image. The purple will be me speaking to you, perhaps with some photographs for you to look at. There's two pink colors. The lighter pink is Susan Meiselas speaking to us from the perspective of 2020. And the darker pink are sort of past reflections from Susan that we discovered in her archive, either press or educational interviews. We have related work by Susan. The green is voices of participants and collaborators. So it's really important to think about there being three ways to navigate the exhibition. There's the curatorial perspective you get from me. There's the perspective you get from Susan, the artist, and there's the perspective you get from the participants and collaborators. You can also examine newspaper clippings and other historical content. But let's just see what it looks like. So here's the banner that we talked about. And you can see here, you can find video clips that will tell you more about the work. You can see the context. You can hear Susan speaking with critic Lucy Lepard about this project. And I'm just going to walk you through the exhibition so you can see a little bit how it works. It's kind of exciting to zoom through. And then I've selected a few videos that I thought we might look at together.
I look back at this picture and realize how psychologically perfect it was, an expression of my own psyche, really. feeling the awkwardness of visibility, wanting to be invisible, on the other hand, present, not fully absent in my own space, in my own life, and in the relationship I was trying to explore through photography with others. I'm a woman who's graduating in 1970 on the cusp, but I've lived through the early 60s, which I'm too young to participate in, though of course I'm impacted by what's happening in the South and civil rights movement, issues of segregation or integration, open housing in my own community. My mother works for the segregated community. She works across the line in the Black community in that period of the 60s. So I'm highly influenced by the cultural movements of that period, even if I can't fully participate. And I think that's important to think about then. The 70s become the opportunity to participate, and participation is through photography. Initially, I think I imagined myself as a working woman, not necessarily a photographer, but a woman who could both have a family and have a working life. Eventually, I had to make a choice I didn't expect to make, in fact. But by the time I come of age, I can make choices that women before me couldn't do.
So you can see just how rich an experience this is when you have an opportunity to hear from the artist directly about what it meant to make work, what it meant to become a photographer. I'm going to concentrate a bit on Carnival Strippers and get us to this picture of Shorty, which we discussed. So you can hear from Susan directly.
Shorty here is exhausted. It's the end of the night. I kind of love that she veils herself, even though that's not for anyone but herself. Whatever time of night this photograph might have been taken, she's thinking of the hours ahead or the days after, if it's the beginning of, a weekend. It was hard work. Generally, they worked from as early in the afternoon as 4:30 or 5, all the way till midnight or 1 or 2, depending on the spots. Men were drunker later into the nights. You have to imagine they're doing a 3-minute dance, rotating on and off a stage continuously, with maybe a 15-minute break in between shows. So it was constant, on your feet, and with varying audiences, having to constantly respond, and therefore draining, physically demanding, psychologically demanding. I think Shorty is self-contained. I'm present. She knows I'm there. She's not feeling she needs to protect herself from me or the lens. So she's obviously comfortable with the fact that this is a moment that's being photographed. But she's not performing herself for me. It's interesting in the Manet painting. That is very much more contemporary look, right, that we would see today, the performative or reenact moment. I don't sense that. I didn't sense that very much at all. Most of the work behind the scenes, and especially the dressing room, were there just being or hoping to survive in between shows to get up the energy to engage again on the stage. And sometimes teasing each other, and sometimes not wanting to talk at all with each other, sometimes tensions between them, depending on who was performing each night, which constantly was changing. So they were having to build new relationships on the road week to week, as well as I was.
And as I mentioned, it's important to know that hearing from the participant or the person that Susan photographed is equally important to her. And so I want to play you a clip from Lena that Susan actually recorded at the time, really, when this photograph was taken.
Lena.
Hi, Lena.
You need another girl?
Yeah, how old are you?
18.
Yeah.
I'm on a job.
You got a job.
What do I do? I'm.
Now, as soon as they get through getting stuff together, I'll take you in there. Let you meet the girl.
I can dance, and I can dance very well. I do dance extremely well. I'm not so good at taking my clothes off.
That's what we'll show you. If you can dance, it'll be much easier.
I can dance.
Come on, that's a good style. You have your clothes here?
Yeah, my husband kicked me out.
Well, your husband?
We're divorced.
Well, he's here?
No.
Well, how should we get your clothes and bring them down here? Well, what else
Okay.
here?
Okay.
What are you at?
All I've got is one suitcase and a bag of dirty clothes.
We'll bring them down, and then you'll go back to the hotel tonight with us. Your name is what now?
Lena Quintel.
Lena.
Lena.
Quintel.
Right.
Okay.
They're really gonna call me from the station.
I like that Lena.
Okay.
So that kind of gives you a real sense of, in that moment, when that picture is being taken, what is she thinking? She's just been sort of kicked out of her house by her husband. She says she's divorced. She's got a bag of dirty clothes with her, and this seems like her best option. We hear from Lena a little bit later with somewhat of a different perspective. So again, this was recorded when the photograph was taken by Susan. And you'll hear Lena speaking with Susan here.
I like things that I like the freedom the men had more than I did the freedom the women had. And I could identify with them, and I wanted to be with them.
So what kind of things would you do with them?
I would go out and just bullshit with them. I wanted to talk with them and be able to go out riding around or whatever it was that they could do, that I couldn't do. I mean, they could just do anything, like it seemed like they could do whatever they wanted to. They could become or be anything. They were sort of always open and stronger, than the women. I mean, the girls, I should say, the girls seemed like they had to have somebody to make them whole, whereas the men were just whole in the beginning.
Yeah.
The girls just seemed like they were just objects, and they weren't whole, like half a piece of pie or whatever.
Okay, but you see, what you just said, is that they were objects, right? The women were objects. But then some people would say to you, but Lena, you made yourself into a stripper, and that was the super object for men, right? So how do you...
Well, of course, because I want men to take notice of me. And
but at the same time...
I like attention, but I think what I like more about stripping is that it's sort of something that's not socially accepted. You sort of have to live in a man's world. I think as far as being a stripper, it's as close to being in a man's world as you can be.
So considering how someone with no power might try and create power for themselves, create a way for themselves to have a voice. It's interesting to think about carnival strippers in relation to this body of work, Women in the U.S. Army. And Susan talks a little bit about the relationship between those two bodies of work here.
So the working life of the strippers was not that different in some ways from the evolution of becoming a Marine or joining the U.S. Army. This was really women integrating into a unit, in a platoon, a collectivity that was in contrast really to carnival strippers, where women were distinguished by their varying bodies or their spirits or their energies, their style, their sexiness. This was just the opposite. Women were being asked to unify and conform and be somewhat controlled, essentially by men. So in contrast, the women that I was looking at with strippers were unleashing their femininity to entice men. They navigated themselves and protected themselves on the stage. Even if there were two women on stage, that they worked together. They were still in some kind of a competitive mode. It wasn't conceived as a collective environment, whereas I think the women of the Army Corps were being shaped to be one, and the women in the Army were confronted with having to be in some denial of what made them women, except maybe learning to put on their mascara, though I always found it astounding that anyone would be thinking about that in the midst of a war. What was the point of that? This is still at a time where women were not being sent to the front lines. That comes later. This is at the time where women are probably doing administrative tasks or running the kitchen, but not really frontline war confrontational settings. And in a way, the strippers were more at war. What it involved, the resilience it took. There is something different than a woman kind of alone, meeting women on the road. The appeal of the open road brings them together. And a woman who joins the Army, that really is an institutional commitment, right? And they become part of a collective force that they then identify themselves within. Somewhat different processes, though they might equally be proud of that leap, because at that time, both women are leaping beyond what's expected of them.
So you can imagine just how wonderful it was for me and for Ariel to spend 6 months interviewing Susan and hearing from her and getting her perspectives. And then our teams working together to create these videos so that you can hear from her as well. Because she's really just got so much rich, considered thought to share with us. And so here, I just want to mention that I talked a little bit about Susan's building relationships. And so what you see here are iPads, which of course you can't look at in the 360 tour that we're presenting to you, but you can actually see the clips that they would show. And so in this gallery, we have clips from a film Susan put together with a number of collaborators called Pictures from a Revolution, where you get to learn the stories of the people in the photographs once she returned to try and find the people in the pictures. And here I'll play you a clip.
Era bien inteligente desde chiquito. Entonces, un día dijeron que habían becas. Fueron las primeras becas, los primeros alumnos que salían, pero que eran los mejores alumnos los que iban a salir. Entonces, él me vino diciendo bien entusiasmado, mamá, me dice, hay unas becas para Cuba, déjeme ir, pero pequeño, es él. Sí, mamacita, déjeme ir, no me va a comprar nada. No, amor, no te puedes ir, me cortó. No seas grosero, no es que está muy chiquito. Sí, mamá, yo cuando sea grande voy a trabajar y le voy a ayudar, déjeme ir. Es él. Ahí dice, junto con algunos compañeros de mi grupo, entre ellos hay árabes democráticos, etiopíes, cubanos y nambíos. Es decir, que ahí no hay nicaragüenses, solo él. Aquí me dio una gran sorpresa cuando porque nunca me había mandado fotos de que se fue chiquito, un poquito más grande que aquí. Cuando él me manda a decir que lo descubra, que cuál de esos es él. Yo empezaba a buscar y a buscar, no, este es muy feo, muy flaco, será este. Ay, pero entonces llamé al telegrafista y le digo, vení vos, ayúdame, cuál es Memo, que yo no lo conozco. Yo tenía 7 años de no verlo, porque él se fue de 11 años sobre 12. Cuando él regresa, que él me dice que viene en julio, no vino hasta el 1 de agosto. Cuando yo llego al aeropuerto, mi hijo, ¿cuál será? Si yo no lo conocía, pero en fotos, no, si este no es mi hijo. Él era chiquito, blanquito, y en el aeropuerto lo buscaba, pero él me conoció a mí, mi mamá, dice, y un hombre grande como él, un señor alto, un muchachón alto, rubio, bien bonito. Entonces ya él, claro, esperamos que saliera del aeropuerto, ya me abrazó, bien alegre, bien grande. Vino bien educado, bien preparado, toma poco licor, fuma poco, es bien dedicado. Entonces él se gana por su conducta una beca a la URSS, hacerse ingeniero en la carrera.
Sí, después del triunfo lo que pienso yo es, al principio, ser una buena militar. Yo quería ser tanquista, tirar tanque. Pero en esos tiempos, ¿verdad? No había una buena, o sea, se estaba empezando a estructurar todo eso. O ser paracaidista, y me gustaba, o ser una buena instructora militar. Eso lo me gustaba a mí por eso. Pero en vista pues de que no hay opción en ese momento de preparar a la mujer en ese sentido. Entonces yo me salgo y me pongo a dar clase de educación física en una escuela secundaria. Tengo mi primer hijo, ¿verdad? Jaime Saúl. Después paso a la estructura del Ministerio del Interior. Después me trasladan para el ejército. Estudio en el ejército. Después problemas de salud en otro niño que se murió. Pido licenciamiento, ¿verdad? Y me salgo sin nada, sin pensar nada.
The day we went to film her, Marta told me that she was now living with Luis, who was a Contra, who was kidnapped by the Contra and then traveled and fought with the Contra for 4 years. It was the most difficult thing for her to say. And yet the most important, it was the thing that had separated her from a lot of the people she traveled with before.
No corra mucho. O sea, cuando uno estaba en la guerrilla, existía una fraternidad, una hermandad, no existía egoísmo. Si vos tenías un granito de frijol y teníamos que agarrar ese granito de frijol y compartirlo entre todos, para que todos comiéramos. Y ahora no es así. Ahora no es así, po. Duele decirlo, po. Duele decirlo de que si yo tengo, po. No puedo compartir ya. ¿Y por dónde está Napoleón?
Estoy en Canadá.
En Canadá.
So that gives you a sense of what immersion means to Susan, that it's not just about spending enough time to develop relationships in the moment, but also to continue to consider how the passage of time might influence the people in the photographs and how we understand those pictures. So I do want to take questions, but before I do that, I just want to mention a few upcoming events. As I mentioned, on February 18th at 6 p.m. Central, we are hosting a panel discussion on photography and awareness, sharing survivor stories. And we'll have panelists including Esta Solar, who is an advocate and president of Futures Without Violence, Susan Briel, who worked on the first domestic violence campaign in the 1990s in San Francisco. We'll talk about that project. We'll also have some of our community partnerships, Erica Petty from Lotus Legal, and some survivors sharing their stories from Sojourner Family Peace Center. And then in addition, on February 19th, we have an upcoming member art break with Phoenix Brown, who will share some information about the upcoming 3-part collection rotation, American Memory. So with that, I want to thank you all so much for joining us. And I'm going to stop sharing and see if there are any questions. I have a direct question here, which I will happily answer, which is, how did working with Susan influence how I organized the exhibition? And I think that's a really important question in terms of how I work, because for me, it's really important to think about an exhibition almost in the way that Susan thinks about working with her subjects. So if you imagine that self-portrait in which she's almost a transparency, that she's trying to bring together the subject and the viewer without mediating too much. That's sort of, in a way, how I approach organizing an exhibition, in that I really want to make sure I'm bringing Susan's ideas to you, to the viewers directly, and to work with her to ensure that the museum is providing that kind of platform, so that we can best share all of the context that goes into to her thought process and to how we might interpret those photographs. Okay. So I have a question from an attendee about what Susan is doing now. And I will tell you that Susan is someone who does everything at all times. And so we just hosted a conversation last week, I believe, on a project called Collaboration, A Potential History of Photography, in which she is working with a number of scholars and artist Wendy Ewald to publish a book on what collaboration might mean in photography if we're thinking more broadly, not just about photographers working together, but what are the relationships between the photographer and the subject, or the spectator to the photograph. So that's one project that you'll see coming from her. She's also president of Magnum Photos. And there are a number of other things. I do suggest that you check out her website, where you can see all of the various projects she's done over the years, because she has quite an impressive body of work. There's a question here about whether Susan has collaborated with a group of men, and does she think it's possible across genders? And I would say, of course. The Lando project was a collaboration with an entire town and included many students of all genders. I think I sort of see collaboration as a feminist practice, but I don't think it's gender specific. I think it's just a question of inviting all of the voices that are at the table. So those voices can be any kinds of people, all kinds of people. Are there any plans to create a VR experience where the viewer would wear a VR headset to make it even more immersive? I've actually seen people thinking about this. It hasn't been done successfully yet, but I'm certain that that will eventually be part of how we consume media, but we're not quite there yet. Will there be a catalog? There are numerous catalogs for Susan's exhibitions. I'm holding one here called Susan Meiselas Mediations, for an exhibition that traveled through Europe and was at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art last year, or maybe 2 years ago now. I think in some ways we're thinking about the virtual tour as a catalog in and of itself, a different kind of way of interacting with the work, providing a more media-rich resource. So that is sort of our answer to a catalog. Was Susan's work or life driven by an ideology or philosophy? I don't want to answer that for her, but I think I would say that she is driven by the idea of immersion, by an interest in what stories need to be told and how she might tell them effectively. You know, she is a member of Magnum Photos, so I think that history of social documentary is foremost to her, but she definitely would consider herself a documentary photographer and not a photojournalist. And I think she did speak a bit about that in the opening conversation, and so that's something you can look back to if you're interested in hearing more from her about that. And then there's a question about whether once the museum is fully open, we will have whether our exhibitions will have such a rich of media, in-person and virtual presentation. And I think that's a great question, because I think if anything the pandemic has taught us, it's that in-person experiences and virtual experiences are both really important. And so we've been having a lot of conversations within the museum about how we might offer presentations of media-rich experiences that are perhaps not just like the 360-degree virtual tour, but all different kinds of things. And so ideally that will be something we'll see a lot more of moving forward. And I'll be excited to share more with you once we have plans in place that I can share. But please do know that is something the museum has talked quite a bit about over the past year, if not more. Okay. And there's a question about whether this presentation will be available on the MAM website, and I believe it will. And you can check into the museum's website for the Meiselas exhibition page, where you can find a link to the 360-degree virtual tour. You can find a link to the opening conversation, and where we will also be posting these presentations and the 2 public panels that we hosted or are hosting in the future as they are ready for you. And so with that, if there are no more questions, I think I'm going to thank you all so much for joining us, and I hope you will spend some time digging into the virtual tour and seeing all of the resources it offers. And I see a question about her switching between black and white and color, and I can tell you that there is a video in the 360-degree tour that does address that. And she talks quite a bit about transitioning between black and white and color between the Carnival Strippers project and Nicaragua. So please do access that material to answer that question. Okay. Thank you all so much for your membership, for supporting us, and for spending this afternoon with me today. Take care.